when an 18-year-old girl crashed through the back door of a restaurant soaking wet, bleeding from a cut above her eye, and collapsed on the floor in front of the corner booth. Nobody moved. Not the kitchen staff, not the waiters, not the two men sitting near the wall who hadn't touched their food in 20 minutes. The only person who moved was the man in the corner booth. The man nobody in that city looked at directly. He saw the bruise along her jaw. He saw the blood mixing with rainwater running down her cheek. And then he saw the man who walked in behind her, tall, calm, smiling, adjusting his jacket like this was all a misunderstanding. "She's my stepdaughter," the man said. "She's having an episode." The Mafia boss didn't look at him. He knelt down, looked the girl in the eyes, and asked one question. "Do you know him?" And what she whispered back set fire to everything that man had built. Rain had turned the alley behind Marchetti's into something out of a nightmare. It was the kind of rain that didn't just fall. It attacked. It hammered the pavement in thick, unrelenting sheets, flooding the gutters, turning every crack in the sidewalk into a tiny, rushing river. The neon sign above the restaurant's back entrance flickered red, then white, then red again, casting the alley in a pulsing glow that made the puddles look like they were bleeding. Inside the restaurant, the dinner service was winding down. Marchetti's was the kind of place where the tablecloths were always white. The wine was always expensive, and the conversations at the corner booth in the back were never to be repeated. It was a Tuesday night, quiet by most standards, and the staff had already started clearing the tables closest to the kitchen. Kieran Ashford sat at that corner booth, his back to the wall, the way he always sat. He was 46 years old, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that had gone silver at the temples. His jaw was set in a way that suggested it had been set that way for most of his life. He wore a charcoal suit, no tie, the top button of his shirt undone. There was a glass of bourbon in front of him, untouched. He wasn't there to drink. Across from him sat Luca Brennan, his second in command, a wiry man with sharp eyes and a permanent expression that fell somewhere between suspicion and mild amusement. Luca was in the middle of saying something about a shipment, about a problem at the docks, about a number that didn't add up. But Kieran wasn't listening. He was watching the rain through the window. He'd been doing that a lot lately, watching things without seeing them, sitting in rooms full of people and hearing nothing. There was a heaviness in him that had settled in years ago and never left, a weight that pressed on his chest every morning when he woke up and every night when he tried, and usually failed, to sleep. Luca noticed, of course. Luca noticed everything, but he didn't say anything about it. He'd learned a long time ago that there were doors inside Kieran Ashford that didn't open, no matter how hard you knocked. "You want me to handle the dock thing myself?" Luca asked, tapping his fork against the rim of his plate. Kieran blinked, refocused. "Yeah, take Novak with you. I want it sorted by Thursday." Consider it done. The moment should have ended there. The night should have continued like every other night. Business discussed. Bourbon eventually sipped. The drive home in the black sedan. The empty house. The silence. But the night didn't continue like every other night, because that was when the girl came through the back door. She didn't open the door so much as crash through it. The emergency exit near the kitchen, the one the staff used for smoke breaks, burst inward with a sound like a gunshot, and suddenly there she was, stumbling into the narrow hallway between the kitchen and the dining room, soaking wet, her shoes slipping on the tile floor. She caught herself on the wall, her palm slapping against it, and for a split second, she just stood there, chest heaving, rain dripping from her hair, and her clothes and her eyelashes. She was young, 18 maybe, thin in a way that suggested she hadn't been eating well. She wore a gray hoodie 3 sizes too big, dark jeans torn at the knees, and sneakers that had once been white but were now the color of mud. Her dark hair was plastered to her face, and her eyes, wide, brown, wild with terror, scanned the hallway like a trapped animal looking for a way out. The kitchen staff froze. A busboy carrying a tub of dirty dishes stopped in his tracks, his mouth open. One of the line cooks turned from the stove, spatula in hand, and just stared. And then the girl saw the dining room. She saw the tables, the white tablecloths, the well-dressed people. She saw the corner booth. She saw Kieran Ashford. She ran. Toward him. Not toward him exactly. Toward the space behind him, the wall, the corner. Anywhere that felt like a barrier between her and whatever was behind her. She made it about 10 feet into the dining room before her legs gave out. She caught herself on the edge of a table, knocking over a water glass, and sank to her knees on the carpet. Every eye in the room turned to her. Kieran was already on his feet. He didn't know why. Instinct, maybe. Years of reading rooms, of sensing danger before it arrived. Luca was up too, his hand instinctively moving toward the inside of his jacket. The girl looked up at Kieran from the floor. Her lips were trembling. There was a bruise on the left side of her jaw, partially hidden by her hair, and a thin cut above her right eyebrow that was still bleeding. The blood mixing with the rainwater and running down her cheek in a thin, pink line. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Please," she whispered. "Please don't let him. Take me." Before Kieran could respond, the back door crashed open again. A man stepped into the hallway. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with a broad chest and the kind of build that came from a gym membership and a protein shake habit. He was maybe 50, with a close-cropped beard, a receding hairline, and eyes that moved with the quick, efficient sweep of someone who was used to finding what he was looking for. He wore a rain-slicked leather jacket and dark pants, and his face was flushed, not from exertion, but from anger. "Nadia!" His voice was sharp, commanding, the kind of voice that expected obedience. "Nadia, get up. We're leaving, now." The girl, Nadia, flinched at the sound of his voice like she'd been struck. She pressed herself closer to the wall, her fingers gripping the carpet. The man strode through the hallway and into the dining room. He didn't notice the diners. He didn't notice the sudden electric silence that had fallen over the room. He didn't notice Luca Brennan shifting his weight to the balls of his feet, or the way two men at a nearby table, men who had been quietly eating their dinner and who happened to work for Kieran Ashford, put down their forks and turned in their chairs. He only saw the girl. "I said get up." He reached for her arm. "Stop." The word cut through the room like a blade. It came from Kieran. He hadn't raised his voice. He didn't need to. There was something in the way he said it, calm, flat, absolute, that made the man's hand freeze in midair. The man looked up. For the first time, he seemed to register where he was. He saw the restaurant. He saw the faces watching him. He saw Kieran Ashford standing at the corner booth, 6 feet away, his hands at his sides, his expression unreadable. Something flickered across the man's face. Recognition, maybe, or the first faint stirring of unease. But he recovered quickly. He straightened up, adjusted his jacket, put on a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm sorry for the disturbance," he said, his voice shifting into something smoother, more practiced. "This is my stepdaughter. She's having an episode. She does this sometimes. I just need to get her home." Kieran didn't look at the man. He looked at the girl. She was still on the floor, still pressed against the wall, her entire body trembling. And she was shaking her head. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, back and forth. "No, no, no." Kieran lowered himself to one knee. Not quickly, slowly, carefully, the way you'd approach a frightened animal. He brought his face level with hers. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, gentle in a way that made Luca, who had known him for 20 years, look at him with something close to surprise. "Do you know him?" 3 words, simple, direct. Nadia's eyes locked onto Kieran's. The trembling in her body intensified. She looked at the man standing behind Kieran, then back at Kieran, her lips parted. "He's my stepfather," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper. The man behind them let out a relieved breath. "See? Like I said, he's been selling me." The room went completely silent, not the kind of silence that falls when someone says something awkward, not the polite, uncomfortable pause of a dinner party misstep. This was the silence of every person in the room processing what they'd just heard, and recoiling from it. The man's face drained of color. Nadia's eyes were still locked on Kieran's, and now there was something new in them. Not just fear, but a desperate, gutting hope. The hope of someone who had been screaming for help in a soundproof room and had finally, impossibly, found someone on the other side of the glass. "He's been selling me," she said again, louder this time, "and nobody believes me." What she said next made the most feared man in the city go completely silent. "He told them all I was crazy. He told them I make things up. He has papers, documents from a doctor, a therapist he picked. They say I'm unstable. They say I have episodes." Her voice cracked. "But I'm not crazy. I'm not. He's been doing this for 2 years, and every time I try to tell someone, he shows them the papers and they send me back to him." Kieran Ashford did not move, did not blink, but something shifted behind his eyes, something tectonic, something that cracked open a door he'd kept sealed shut for a very long time. And in that moment, every single person in that restaurant understood that something fundamental had just changed. The man's name was Glenn Hargrave. On paper, he was respectable, more than respectable. He was admirable. He owned a chain of youth outreach centers across the Northeast, 3 in the city alone. He sat on the boards of 2 nonprofits, focused on at-risk teenagers. He gave speeches at fundraisers. He shook hands with city council members. His face appeared in glossy brochures with phrases like "making a difference" and "investing in our future" printed in hopeful fonts. He had married Nadia's mother, Patricia, 4 years ago, when Nadia was 14. Patricia had been a waitress at a diner in Bridgeport, a quiet, worn-down woman who worked double shifts and never complained. She'd been raising Nadia alone since Nadia's biological father left when Nadia was 3. When Glenn Hargrave walked into that diner with his pressed shirts and his easy charm and his talk about a better life, Patricia thought she'd won the lottery. They moved into his house in Fairfield County within 6 months. It was the nicest place either of them had ever lived. 4 bedrooms, a swimming pool, a kitchen with granite countertops. Patricia cried the first night they slept there. Happy tears, she said. Everything was going to be different now. For a while, it was. Glenn was generous, attentive. He bought Nadia new clothes, signed her up for a private school, told her she could call him whatever she wanted. Glenn, Dad, Mr. Hargrave, it didn't matter to him. He helped her with her homework. He took them on vacations. He was, by all external measures, a good man doing a good thing. The shift happened slowly. It started with small things, rules that seemed reasonable at first, but gradually tightened. Nadia wasn't allowed to have friends over without Glenn's approval. Her phone was checked every night. She couldn't close her bedroom door. These rules were presented as concern, as protection, as the careful boundaries of a man who worked with troubled youth and knew all too well what could happen to a teenage girl without proper guidance. Patricia accepted this. She had never had a partner who cared so much. She didn't see the walls closing in because she'd never had walls at all. She'd had open sky and no safety net, and she mistook the cage for shelter. The real horror began when Nadia was 16. She would never tell the full story all at once. It would come out in fragments over hours and days and weeks. Small, broken pieces of a picture so terrible that the mind refused to see it whole. She told Kieran the first piece that night, on the floor of Marchetti's restaurant, with the rain hammering the windows and Glenn Hargrave standing 10 feet away with a smile that was starting to crack. There are men," she said. "They come to the house when my mom's working. He tells her he's hosting meetings for the outreach centers. Board meetings, donor dinners. She believes him." She swallowed. Her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't hold them still. "They're not board meetings." Kieran Ashford did not believe in coincidence. He believed in patterns, in the way the world arranged itself around systems of power and control. He believed that most people were capable of terrible things if they thought they could get away with it. He believed that the law, for all its noble intentions, was a structure built to protect those who understood how to use it and to crush those who didn't. He believed these things because he had spent his entire adult life operating in the space between what was legal and what was real. But he also believed, in a private, closely guarded chamber of his heart, that certain debts could never be repaid, and that certain failures could never be forgiven. He was 19 when his sister disappeared. Her name was Colleen. She was 16, sharp-tongued and stubborn, with the same dark eyes Kieran had, and a laugh that could fill a room. She went to a party one Friday night in October, the kind of unremarkable high school party that happened in every city in America, and she never came home. They found her car 3 days later, parked at a rest stop off 1895, the driver's door open, her backpack still on the passenger seat. They never found Colleen. The investigation lasted 2 years. It produced nothing. No suspects, no leads, no body. The detective assigned to the case, a man named Dravecki, told Kieran's mother that sometimes these things just happened. That sometimes people disappeared, and the world simply closed over the space where they'd been, like water filling a hole. Kieran's mother never recovered. She spent the rest of her life sitting by the phone in the kitchen, waiting for a call that never came. She died 12 years later, still waiting. Kieran rebuilt himself around the absence. He became something harder, something colder, something that could move through the world without being destroyed by it. He built an empire, not the kind they write about in business magazines, but the kind that operated in the spaces those magazines pretended didn't exist. He became powerful. He became feared. He became the man at the corner booth that nobody looked at directly. But he never stopped seeing Colleen's face in the face of every frightened girl he passed on the street. He never stopped wondering what she had felt in those final moments, whether she had screamed, whether she had fought, whether she had looked for him and found no one there. It was the one wound that never closed, and now, kneeling on the floor of his own restaurant, looking into the eyes of an 18-year-old girl with a bruise on her jaw and blood on her face, he felt that wound tear open all over again. Glenn Hargrave was not stupid. He could see what was happening. He could see the way the room had turned against him, the way the staff had stopped moving, the way the 2 men at the nearby table had risen to their feet. He could feel the ground shifting beneath him, but Glenn Hargrave was also not the kind of man who panicked. He was the kind of man who adapted. "This is exactly what I was talking about," he said, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of someone who had spent years convincing people of things that weren't true. "She does this. She creates these stories. It's part of her condition." He reached into his jacket and produced a folded piece of paper. He held it up like a shield. "I have documentation from her psychiatrist, Dr. Leland Reese. You can call him. His number's right here. He'll tell you she has a history of fabrication. Delusions. It's a trauma response from her childhood. Her biological father was violent and she put that away." Kieran's voice was still calm, but something had changed in it. There was an edge now, a hardness that hadn't been there before. He stood up slowly, turning to face Hargrave for the first time. Glenn Hargrave was 6'2" and broad. Kieran Ashford was 6 feet and lean. But when Kieran turned his full attention on someone, the physical dimensions stopped mattering. There was a gravity to him, a density, like standing next to something that had its own weather system. People didn't move toward Kieran Ashford. They were pulled. "She needs to come home," Glenn said. He was still smiling, but the smile had thinned. "I'm her legal guardian. I have every right." "You have the right to stand there," Kieran said, quietly. "And that's all you have right now." The 2 men locked eyes. Glenn Hargrave had looked into the eyes of many people over the years. Frightened teenagers, gullible donors, skeptical social workers. He had learned to read people the way a predator reads terrain, identifying the soft spots, the blind spots, the places where pressure could be applied. But looking into Kieran Ashford's eyes, he saw nothing soft, nothing blind. He saw something ancient and patient and absolutely certain of what it was. For the first time that evening, Glenn Hargrave felt afraid. "Luca," Kieran said without turning his head. "Yeah. Get her some water and a blanket and close the restaurant." "Done." Luca moved with the kind of efficient purpose that suggested he'd been waiting for exactly these instructions. Oh, within 3 minutes, the remaining diners had been politely ushered out. The front doors were locked, the closed sign was lit, and Nadia Voss was sitting in the corner booth, with a wool blanket around her shoulders and a glass of water in her trembling hands. Glenn Hargrave was still standing in the middle of the dining room, alone. "You can't do this," he said, and for the first time, there was a crack in his composure. "This is kidnapping. She's a minor. She's under my care. I'll call the police." "Call them," Kieran said. He sat down across from Nadia, his back to Hargrave. "I'd love for the police to hear what she has to say." The crack in Glenn's composure widened. His jaw tightened. His right hand, the one that had reached for Nadia earlier, clenched into a fist at his side. "You don't know what you're getting involved in," he said. Kieran didn't respond. "I have friends," Glenn continued, his voice dropping. "People who know people, people who can make things very difficult for you." At this, Kieran did something unexpected. He smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was not the kind of smile you see on birthday cards or in family photos. It was the kind of smile that a wolf might give if wolves could smile. A baring of teeth that communicated with perfect clarity that the person on the receiving end had made a catastrophic miscalculation. "Glenn," Kieran said, and the use of his first name, casual, familiar, dismissive, made Hargrave flinch. "I think you should sit down." He gestured to an empty chair at a nearby table. The gesture was polite. The implication was not. Glenn Hargrave looked at the chair. He looked at Kieran. He looked at Luca, who was standing by the door with his arms crossed, and at the two other men, who had taken positions on either side of the room with the quiet precision of people who did this for a living. He sat down. The story came out slowly. Nadia spoke in fits and starts, her words tumbling over each other, then stopping, then starting again. She apologized constantly for crying, for not making sense, for being there at all. Kieran told her, each time, that she didn't need to apologize for anything, that she could take as long as she needed. It had started, she said, with a man named Boyd Ellison. He was a real estate developer who donated heavily to Glenn's outreach centers. He came to the house one evening when Patricia was working a double. Nadia was 16. Glenn told her to put on something nice. There was an important donor coming, and it would mean a lot to Glenn if she made a good impression. She put on a dress. She came downstairs. Boyd Ellison was sitting in the living room with a glass of whiskey. He was in his 60s with white hair and a gold watch, and a way of looking at her that made her skin crawl. Nothing happened that night. Not exactly. Ellison just talked to her, asked about school, complimented her, touched her shoulder once briefly when he laughed at something she said. But when he left, he handed Glenn an envelope, and Glenn's mood, which had been tense all day, lifted like a cloud passing from in front of the sun. The visits increased. Different men, always when Patricia was working. Always the same instruction. Put on something nice. Always the same ritual, the conversation, the compliments, the touches that grew less brief and less innocent over time, and always, afterward, the envelope. When Nadia tried to resist, Glenn punished her, not with violence, that came later, but with isolation. He took her phone. He pulled her out of school, claiming he was homeschooling her. He cut off her contact with friends, with extended family, with anyone who might listen. When she tried to tell her mother, Glenn was ready. He sat Patricia down and explained with great sadness and concern that Nadia was acting out, that she was struggling, that he'd consulted a psychiatrist, Dr. Leland Reese, a man whose practice Nadia would later discover received generous donations from Glenn's nonprofit, and that Nadia was showing signs of a serious delusional disorder. Patricia, who loved her daughter desperately, but who had spent her entire life trusting the wrong people, believed him. Nadia told a teacher. The teacher called social services. A caseworker came to the house. Glenn produced the psychiatric documentation. The caseworker saw a clean, beautiful home, a concerned stepfather, and a girl with a documented history of fabrication. The case was closed in 11 days. Nadia told a school counselor before Glenn pulled her from school. The counselor called Glenn. Glenn showed the counselor the documents. The counselor apologized to Glenn for the disruption. Nadia tried to walk to a police station. Glenn found her 6 blocks from the house and brought her home. The next day, the bruises started. By the time she was 17, Nadia Voss had become invisible. She existed in the space between Glenn's public respectability and his private monstrousness, a space so narrow and so dark that she sometimes forgot she was real. She stopped trying to tell people. She stopped fighting. She became the quiet, compliant girl that Glenn showed to the world, proof that his outreach work extended to his own home, that even a troubled stepdaughter could be saved with enough patience and love. She turned 18 3 weeks ago. On the night she ran, Glenn had told her there would be a gathering. 3 men, he said. Important men. This would be different from the others, he said. This time she wouldn't be coming back upstairs until morning. Something in those words, the casual finality of them, the complete absence of pretense, broke through the numbness that had settled over her like snow. She felt, for the first time in months, the sharp, electric jolt of pure survival instinct. She waited until Glenn was in the shower. She put on her sneakers. She walked out the front door, and she ran. She ran for 40 minutes through the rain. No phone, no money, no plan. She ran until her legs buckled, and the world blurred. And the only thing keeping her upright was the knowledge that if she stopped, she would be caught. She turned down alleys and cut through parking lots, and ducked behind dumpsters when she heard footsteps. Glenn found her twice. The first time she slipped away when he stopped to answer his phone. The second time she threw herself through the back door of the first lit building she could find. It happened to be Marchetti's. When Nadia finished speaking, the restaurant was silent. Not the tense silence of earlier. This was something deeper, heavier, the silence of people who had just been told something that changed the shape of the world. Luca was standing by the bar, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on a point on the floor. The 2 men by the wall had gone completely still. Even the kitchen staff clustered near the hallway door had stopped pretending to work and were simply listening. Kieran sat across from Nadia, with his hands folded on the table. His face was composed, but if you knew what to look for, and Luca knew what to look for, you could see the storm behind his eyes. A muscle in his jaw jumped. His knuckles were white. He didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, his voice was low and steady. Nadia, I need you to listen to me very carefully. She looked at him. Her eyes were red and swollen, her face blotchy from crying. You are not going back to that house. Not tonight. Not ever. Do you understand me? She blinked. Then her face crumpled, and she covered her mouth with her hand, and she cried. Not the terrified gasping sobs of earlier, but a deeper, more wrenching kind of crying. The crying of someone who had been holding a door shut for 2 years and had finally been told they could let go. Kieran waited. He didn't reach for her. He didn't tell her to stop. He just sat there, a steady, immovable presence, and let her fall apart. Across the room, Glenn Hargrave watched this with the expression of a man who had stepped into a trap and was only now beginning to understand how deep it went. This is insane, he said. His voice was louder now, edged with something that wanted to be authority, but was starting to sound like panic. You can't just keep her here. She's not well. She needs her medication. She needs... What medication? Kieran asked without looking at him. The question landed like a stone in water. Her psychiatric medication. For her condition. Dr. Reese prescribed... What's the name of the medication, Glenn? Silence. What's the dosage? Silence. What pharmacy fills the prescription? Glenn's mouth opened and closed. His face had gone a strange, mottled red. I don't have all the details in front of me. My wife handles... Your wife doesn't know, Glenn. Nadia's voice cut through the room, raw and hoarse but steady. I've never taken any medication. Because there is no medication. Because there's no condition. You made it all up. The silence that followed was absolute. Glenn Hargrave stood in the middle of the empty restaurant, surrounded by men who answered to someone far more powerful than any donor or city council member. And he understood, with a clarity that must have felt like ice water in his veins, that the system he'd built to protect himself had just collapsed. He ran. He turned and bolted for the back door with the clumsy, desperate speed of a man who had never in his life had to run from anything. He made it 4 steps before one of Kieran's men, a broad-shouldered man named Novak, stepped into his path. Glenn veered left. Another man blocked him. He tried to push past, and Novak caught his arm, not roughly, but firmly, the way you'd restrain someone who was about to do something foolish. "Let go of me," Glenn's voice cracked. The mask was gone now. The smooth, reasonable, concerned stepfather mask had fallen away, and underneath it was something small and ugly and afraid. "You don't know who I am. You don't know who I know. I will destroy you. All of you. I have lawyers. I have connections. I have—" "Sit down, Glenn." Kieran hadn't moved from the booth. He hadn't raised his voice. He spoke the way you'd speak to a dog that was barking too loud. Novak guided Glenn back to the chair. Glenn sat. His breathing was ragged. His hands were trembling. Kieran looked at Luca. "Call Bryn Torres." Luca nodded and pulled out his phone. Detective Bryn Torres arrived at Marchetti's at 11:47 p.m. She was a compact woman in her early 50s, with short gray hair and the kind of face that had been described over the course of her 30-year career as no-nonsense so many times that the phrase had essentially become part of her name. She wore a dark blazer over a white shirt, and she walked into the restaurant the way she walked into every room, like she'd already read the file. She had a complicated relationship with Kieran Ashford. They'd known each other for almost 20 years. She'd tried to arrest him twice early in her career and failed both times. Over the years, their relationship had settled into something that wasn't exactly friendship and wasn't exactly a truce, but existed in a gray zone that both of them tacitly agreed never to examine too closely. When Kieran Ashford called, Bryn Torres answered, not because she was on his payroll. She wasn't, and the suggestion would have earned you a look that could peel paint. But because Kieran had, on more than one occasion, handed her cases that her own department had missed. Tips, information, threads that, when pulled, unraveled things that mattered. She walked into the restaurant, took in the scene, the girl in the booth, the man in the chair, the men standing by the walls, and raised an eyebrow. "Kieran. Bryn. Thank you for coming." She sat down across from Nadia. She didn't introduce herself yet. She just looked at the girl, at the bruise, the cut, the exhaustion, and something in her face softened, just barely, before hardening again. "Tell me," she said simply. Nadia told her. She told her everything she'd told Kieran, and more. She told her about Boyd Ellison, the real estate developer. She told her about a man named Reuben Chase, who owned a chain of car dealerships. She told her about a state senator named Weymouth, who had a beach house in Westport, where things happened that Nadia couldn't talk about without her voice breaking into pieces. She told Torres about the outreach centers, how Glenn used them not just as cover, but as a pipeline. How he identified vulnerable girls in the programs, girls with no family or no one who would listen, and funneled them to the same men who came to his house. How the center's glowing reputation made them untouchable. She told Torres about Dr. Leland Reese, who had never examined her, but had signed off on a diagnosis that had effectively silenced her for 2 years. Torres listened. She took notes. She asked questions. Specific, precise, the kind of questions that told Nadia this woman had done this before and knew exactly what she was looking for. When Nadia mentioned the senator, Torres's pen stopped moving for just a moment. Then it started again. When Nadia finished, Torres closed her notebook. She looked at Glenn Hargrave, who was sitting in his chair with the rigid stillness of a man who was calculating his options and finding them increasingly narrow. "Mr. Hargrave," Torres said, You are not under arrest at this time, but I'm going to strongly suggest that you not leave the city. I want my lawyer, Glenn said. His voice was thin. You're welcome to call one. Torres stood up and walked to where Kieran was standing by the bar. She spoke quietly. If even half of what she said is true, this is going to be one of the biggest cases this city has seen in a decade. It's true, Kieran said. Torres looked at him. You sound certain. I am. Why? Kieran didn't answer for a moment. Then, quietly. Because I've seen that face before. Torres studied him. She didn't ask what he meant. She'd known him long enough to know that some things he said weren't meant to be answered. They were meant to be understood. Oh, I'll need her to make an official statement, Torres said. And I'll need time. This kind of thing. Outreach centers, a senator, a psychiatrist. It's not something I can move on overnight. I know. She'll need protection. Real protection. If these people are as connected as she says, I'll handle that. Torres sighed. Kieran. Bryn. I'm not going to ask how you plan to handle it. That's probably wise. She shook her head. Get her somewhere safe tonight. I'll be in touch in the morning. The somewhere safe turned out to be a brownstone on the Upper East Side that, on paper, belonged to a holding company that belonged to another holding company, that, if you traced it back far enough through enough layers of legal architecture, eventually connected to a name that Kieran Ashford had never used, but that technically belonged to him. The house was maintained by a woman named Mrs. Calloway, a former nurse in her 60s who asked no questions, kept the pantry stocked, and had a bedroom on the second floor that was always made up with fresh sheets, as if she were always expecting someone. She had been expecting someone, in a sense. Kieran had set this arrangement up years ago, after a situation involving a young man who had testified against a business associate and needed a place to disappear for a while. The house had been used 3 times since then, always for the same purpose. A quiet, safe place where someone could exist without being found. Nadia stood in the foyer of the brownstone at nearly 1 in the morning, still wearing her wet clothes, still wrapped in the blanket from Marchetti's, and looked around with a disoriented expression of someone who had just been pulled from deep water and wasn't yet sure she was alive. Mrs. Calloway appeared at the top of the stairs in a housecoat and slippers, took one look at Nadia and said, "Come with me, sweetheart. Let's get you warm." She led Nadia upstairs. Kieran heard the bath running a few minutes later. He stood in the foyer alone. The house was quiet. The rain had stopped. Luca was outside, making calls. There were things that needed to happen quickly. Security for the house, background checks on Hargrave and his associates. A quiet conversation with a prosecutor Kieran knew. The machinery of response was already in motion. But Kieran stood still. He was thinking about Colleen. She would have been 43 this year. She would have been, what? A teacher, maybe. She'd always been good with kids, or a lawyer. She had that argumentative streak, that refusal to let anything go. She'd have gray in her hair by now, like Kieran did. She'd probably tease him about it. He closed his eyes. For 27 years he had carried the weight of not being there, of being at a friend's house that Friday night in October, watching a football game, eating pizza, doing absolutely nothing, while somewhere on a dark road his little sister. He stopped. He always stopped at the same place. He opened his eyes. He couldn't save Colleen. He had accepted that. Or, more accurately, he had learned to function around the unacceptable truth of it, the way a tree grows around a wound in its trunk. The wound was still there. The tree kept growing. But Nadia Voss was upstairs, in a warm bath, in a safe house, alive. And tomorrow the work would begin. The weeks that followed were methodical and relentless. Torres moved carefully, building the case layer by layer with the patience of someone who had learned the hard way that rushing a case against powerful people was the fastest way to watch it collapse. She secured Nadia's formal statement. She subpoenaed records from Glenn's outreach centers. She obtained a warrant for Dr. Reese's patient files. What she found was staggering. Reese had provided false diagnoses for 6 other girls, all of whom had been through Glenn's outreach programs. 6 girls who had been labeled as delusional, as unstable, as unreliable, and who had then, according to the center's records, aged out of the programs and disappeared from the system entirely. Torres found 2 of them. One was living in a shelter in Newark, hollow-eyed and barely functional. The other was in a hospital in Hartford, recovering from an overdose. Both told stories that echoed Nadia's so precisely that Torres had to put her pen down and walk out of the room for a moment to compose herself. The connections spread outward like cracks in glass. Ellison, the real estate developer; Chase, the car dealership owner; Senator Weymouth, a hedge fund manager named Pruitt; a retired judge named Kellen; men of wealth and influence and spotless reputations, bound together by the shared secret of what they had done in the quiet rooms of Glenn Hargrave's house and what in the back offices of his outreach centers. Kieran provided information when Torres asked for it and stayed out of the way when she didn't. He had his own people looking into things: financial records, property holdings, the web of shell companies and charitable foundations that Hargrave used to move money. This information was passed to Torres through channels that allowed her to discover it independently, preserving the integrity of the case. It was the kind of collaboration that neither of them would ever acknowledge publicly. But it worked. Glenn Hargrave, meanwhile, had retained a defense attorney named Cyrus Webb, a high-profile litigator known for representing clients who could afford to make problems disappear. Webb immediately attempted to discredit Nadia's claims, filing motions to have her psychiatric history entered as evidence of unreliability. But the psychiatric history was the trap, because Dr. Reese, faced with the prospect of losing his license and spending time in a federal facility, folded. He turned over everything: the fabricated diagnoses, the correspondence with Hargrave, the payments routed through the nonprofit. He provided detailed testimony about how Hargrave had approached him, what he'd been asked to do, and how many girls had been affected. The case broke open in the 4th week. Torres had enough for arrest warrants. Hargrave was taken into custody on a Tuesday morning at his home in Fairfield County, in front of the neighbors he'd spent years cultivating with barbecues and Christmas card photos. He was charged with trafficking, conspiracy, and 14 counts related to the exploitation of minors. Ellison was arrested the same day at his office in Midtown. Chase was picked up at one of his dealerships. Pruitt was apprehended at an airport, attempting to board a flight to Zurich. The retired judge, Kellen, was arrested at his lake house upstate. Senator Weymouth resigned before the warrants were issued. His statement, read by a spokesperson, cited personal reasons and a desire to spend more time with family. He was arrested 3 days later at his daughter's home in Virginia. The story broke like a wave. Every major news outlet covered it. The outreach centers were shut down. Investigations were launched. Committees were formed. People who had sat next to Glenn Hargrave at dinner parties and described him as one of the good ones scrambled to distance themselves, to rewrite their memories, to claim they'd always had a feeling about him. Nadia Voss's name was kept out of the press. Torres made sure of that. In court documents, she was identified only as Witness A, a designation that carried the weight of everything she had endured and the anonymity she needed to begin putting her life back together. Patricia Voss came to the brownstone on a Thursday afternoon, 6 weeks after the arrest. Nadia didn't want to see her. She'd told Mrs. Calloway this quietly, while standing at the top of the stairs and looking down at the front door, as if it might open at any moment and let in something she wasn't ready for. "You don't have to," Mrs. Calloway said. "Nobody can make you." "I know." But she went downstairs anyway. Patricia was standing in the foyer, her coat still on, her purse clutched in front of her like a shield. She looked smaller than Nadia remembered. Thinner, her hair was grayer. There were dark circles under her eyes so deep they looked like bruises. They stood facing each other in the quiet hallway, and neither of them spoke for a long time. "I didn't know," Patricia finally said. The words hung in the air like smoke. Nadia looked at her mother. She wanted to scream. She wanted to say, I told you, and you didn't listen. I told you and you chose him." She wanted to say, You were supposed to protect me and you didn't. You were supposed to see me and you didn't. You were supposed to be my mother and you failed. She wanted to say all of these things, and every single one of them was true. But looking at her mother's face, the devastation in it, the total, comprehensive wreckage of a woman who had finally understood what had been happening in her own home, to her own daughter, under her own roof, Nadia felt something unexpected. Not forgiveness. It was too early for that, and she wasn't sure it would ever come. But something adjacent to it. A recognition that her mother was also a victim of Glenn Hargrave's machinery, a different kind of victim, complicit in ways that would haunt her forever, but broken by the same forces that had broken Nadia. I know you didn't know, Nadia said. Patricia's face crumpled. I should have known. I should have... Mom. The word stopped Patricia like a wall. Nadia hadn't called her that in over a year. I can't do this right now, Nadia said quietly. I'm not ready. But I'm not shutting the door. I just need time. Patricia nodded. She pressed her lips together. She turned and walked out of the brownstone without another word, and Mrs. Calloway, watching from the kitchen doorway, wiped her eyes with the corner of her apron and said nothing. The trial began in October. It lasted 3 months. The prosecution presented 216 pieces of evidence. 14 witnesses testified. The defense, led by Cyrus Webb, attempted every strategy available, discrediting witnesses, challenging evidence, questioning jurisdiction. None of it held. Nadia testified on a cold morning in November, in a closed courtroom with only the judge, attorneys, and essential personnel present. She wore a dark blue dress and flat shoes. Her hair was pulled back. She looked older than 18. She spoke for 4 hours. She described what had been done to her and to the other girls with a clarity and steadiness that the prosecutor would later describe privately as the most remarkable display of courage he had ever witnessed in a courtroom. She did not cry. She did not falter. She answered every question, including the brutal ones from the defense, with the measured precision of someone who had spent 2 years being told that her truth was a delusion and who had finally been given a room where her truth was the only thing that mattered. Glenn Hargrave watched from the defense table with the glazed, diminished look of a man who had already been convicted in every way that counted. The jury deliberated for 6 hours, guilty, on all counts. Hargrave was sentenced to 42 years. Ellison received 28. Chase, 24. Pruitt, 31. The retired judge, Kellen, received 18. Senator Weymouth, who had pleaded guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence, received 12. Dr. Reese lost his medical license and received 7 years. The sentencing hearing was the only time Nadia cried in public. Not during the verdict. She'd stood perfectly still for that, her hands clasped in front of her, her chin raised. She cried afterward, in the hallway outside the courtroom, sitting on a wooden bench with Mrs. Calloway on one side and Detective Torres on the other. She cried because it was over. She cried because she was believed. Kieran Ashford did not attend the trial. He followed it from a distance, through Luca, through Torres, through the newspapers that covered it in exhaustive detail. He read every article. He noted every sentence. He filed away the numbers. 42 years, 28 years, 24 years, like debts being settled in a ledger. But he did not go to the courthouse. He did not seek recognition. He did not want Nadia's name connected to his in any public record, and he understood, with the pragmatic clarity that had kept him alive and free for decades, that his presence would only complicate things. He saw Nadia once more, about a month after the trial ended. She came to Marchetti's. Not through the back door this time, through the front, on a clear winter evening, wearing a coat that fit and shoes that were clean, and a scarf she'd bought herself, with money she'd earned from a part-time job at a bookstore in the village. Kieran was at the corner booth. He was always at the corner booth. She walked across the dining room and stood in front of him. She looked different. Healthier. There was color in her face, and the bruise on her jaw had faded to nothing. Her hair was shorter. Her eyes were clear. She didn't sit down. She just stood there for a moment, looking at him, and he looked back at her, and the space between them held everything that had happened and everything that words couldn't carry. "I enrolled at City College," she said. "I start in January." Kieran nodded. "What are you studying?" "Social work." Something moved across his face, not a smile exactly, but the ghost of one. The kind of expression that lives in the space between pride and sorrow. "Good," he said. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She placed it on the table in front of him. "I wrote this for you," she said. "You don't have to read it now. You don't ever have to read it. But I wanted you to have it." She turned and walked out of the restaurant. Kieran sat at the booth for a long time after she left. The restaurant filled up around him. Luca came and went. Orders were taken and plates were served, and the normal machinery of the evening turned and turned. He picked up the paper, unfolded it. It was short, handwritten in careful, slightly uneven script. It said, "You asked me if I knew him." Nobody had ever asked me anything before. They told me things. They told me I was wrong, I was sick, I was imagining it, but you asked. You knelt down and you asked. That was the first time in 2 years that anyone treated me like a person. I don't know everything about you. I don't know what you've done or what people say about you. I only know what you did for me. You gave me a door when every door was closed. Thank you for asking." Kieran read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his jacket pocket over his heart, in the place where years ago he used to keep a photograph of a 16-year-old girl with dark eyes and a laugh that could fill a room. He looked out the window. The sky was clear. The street lights were on. Somewhere out in the city, Nadia Voss was walking home in the cold, free and safe and beginning, and Kieran Ashford, the most feared man in the city, sat alone in his corner booth and felt something he hadn't felt in 27 years. Not redemption. He knew himself too well for that. Not absolution. Those were words for other people, people who lived in the clean, well-lit spaces of the world. What he felt was simpler, quieter. He felt that the weight on his chest, the one that had been there since that October night when his sister didn't come home, had shifted. Not lifted. It would never lift entirely. But it had shifted, the way a stone shifts in a riverbed, and beneath it, for the first time in decades, something was growing. Something small, something green, something that, if he was very careful, might one day become enough. The bourbon sat untouched in front of him. Outside, the city moved on,